In Star Trek, the United Federation of Planets was built on a whole lot of incredible technology, but perhaps the most important of them all was the warp drive. This technology made that interstellar civilization possible. Warp technology was the foundation of not just the Federation, but nearly every major civilization in Star Trek, and it was so fundamental that whether or not a civilization had invented the warp drive was the Federation's standard for when they would advance enough to make first contact with. But how does the warp drive actually work? In this video, we'll be answering that question. Welcome to Trek Central, I'm your host, Captain Jack. Like always, make sure to hit that subscribe button to keep up to date with the latest Star Trek news, lore, and more. And did you know, we're enjoying making these Star Trek videos on various topics, and we hope you enjoy watching them. However, if you do want to keep these videos coming, please consider supporting their development by joining our Patreon using the link below. You'll get exclusive access to videos and events like our book club, as well as more Galaxy class rewards. Please do consider supporting us via Patreon, as it really helps. Now as always, please do let us know your thoughts in the comment section below, because if you're talking about Star Trek, then we want to hear about it. Okay, engage. Today's Star Trek video is brought to you by Trek Central's partner website, the Cargo Bay. This is your ultimate destination for Star Trek merchandise, like the brand new Nacelle Company action figures, featuring Sulu, Jellicoe, Tuvix, and more. The Cargo Bay also has a range of Star Trek themed PC accessories, like Klingon keyboards, mousepads, and even limited edition Star Trek Starship models. If you're into Star Trek collectibles, head to the Cargo Bay via the link in the description, and start exploring. Right, let's get back to Trek. The speed of light is a universal constant, and the laws of physics prevent any object with mass from reaching or surpassing it. This is a major barrier to the development of interstellar civilizations, as even a ship travelling very close to the speed of light, a near impossible feat, would take years just to get from our solar system to the closest neighbouring star, never mind more remote star systems. For interstellar civilization as we usually think of it to work, it needs technology capable of bypassing this universal speed limit somehow. Now, science fiction is full of different theoretical solutions to this problem. From devices that allow ships to cross over to a different dimension where space is greatly compacted, as in Star Wars, to devices capable of bending the fabric of space to create a temporary bridge between two distant points, which is in the reimagined Battlestar Galactica series. Now, Star Trek's solution is actually much more simpler than most theoretical FTL methods, and it all relies on the warp drive. Also known early on as the Space Warp Generator, the Continuum Distortion Propulsion Drive, or the Gravimetric Field Displacement Manifold, the warp drive was powered by matter, antimatter annihilation mediated in a matrix of dilithium crystals, which produced a kind of highly energetic plasma. This plasma was then channeled through a series of warp coils, which generated warp fields around the parent vessel. These warp fields were kind of a subspace displacement that distorted the fabric of space-time, physically warping space-time around the parent vessel. Warp drive shaped these fields into a subspace bubble around the parent starship, and as a warp-capable ship moved forward, the field compacted the fabric of space-time in front of a ship and then smoothed it back out as the ship passed over it. In this way, warp drives bypass the speed of light by making the effective distance the starship had to travel far shorter. Now, warp drive wasn't the only method of faster-than-light travel in the Star Trek universe, but for most of the known history of the galaxy, it is considered the most reliable. The Federation and other civilizations experimented with a variety of faster alternatives, including a trans-warp drive, quantum slipstream drive, and spore drive, but none of these supplanted warp travel until the end of the 32nd century, when Starfleet's new pathway drive began to steadily phase out this time-honoured technology. As you might expect from devices of such enormous power, warp drives were complicated pieces of technology, and they took up so much of your average starship that most starships were designed around their needs. The central and most important part of a standard Starfleet warp drive was the warp core, which was usually housed deep in the engineering hulls of Starfleet vessels. The warp core was the reactor where the all-important matter-antimatter annihilation took place, the most sensitive and potentially dangerous component of the whole warp drive. For fuel, warp cores used deuterium and antideuterium, the latter of which was contained within magnetic fields, preventing uncontrolled antimatter annihilation. These two fuels were combined in a dilithium crystal matrix at the heart of the warp core. This dilithium matrix actually served two purposes. One, it provided power for the ship, and two, it allowed the matter-antimatter annihilation to happen safely. Dilithium was unique in that it was the only kind of baryonic matter that was non-reactive with antimatter, albeit only when subjected to high-frequency electromagnetic fields. As a result, deuterium and anti-deuterium could react within the dilithium matrix without destroying the entire starship. The warp plasma produced by this reaction was channeled through a series of plasma conduits, which typically led from the starship's engineering hull, where the warp core was located, to the vessel's nacelles, where the rest of the warp drive was housed. The warp nacelles of Starfleet's vessels contained the warp coils, which were what actually generated the starship's warp field. Plasma injectors in the nacelles fed warp plasma into these coils, providing sufficient power for the coils to create a subspace bubble. Most Starfleet vessels had 2 warp nacelles, and thus 2 sets of warp coils, as had been the tradition for human starships since the first flight of the Phoenix. Federation scientists did determine this to be the most efficient warp coil configuration, but it wasn't the only viable one. A few Starfleet vessel designs had more than 2 warp nacelles, or even just 1, as we'll discuss in a bit. Other intergalactic species also had other ways of laying out their vessel's warp coils. On top of containing the warp coils themselves, the warp nacelles of Starfleet's vessels also featured bussard collectors, which were typically managed at the front of a nacelle. These ram scoops were used to passively gather deuterium and sometimes other molecules from interstellar space, which the starship could then use as fuel for the warp core. As a result, a starship travelling through warp, its fuel supplies were replenished even as they were being used. Most warp drives seen in the Alpha Quadrant, and even those of non-Alpha Quadrant civilizations, like the Dominion, generally follow this layout to some extent. However, as can be expected when a technology is independently developed by many different civilizations, there are quite a few variants of the standard warp drive floating around the galaxy. One of the most distinctive was the annular warp drive used by the Vulcans, which housed the starship's warp coil in a single, massive warp ring rather than a pair of nacelles. Some sources also established that some Klingon starships, like the Bird of Prey, had plate-like warp coils built into their wings, which otherwise functioned like traditional Starfleet warp coils. The principles on which warp drives operate could also be different between civilizations. Romulan warp drives, for example, were powered by artificial quantum singularities, instead of matter-antimatter annihilation, and this also generated warp plasma but in a radically different way. The speed of a starship at warp was variable, and most modern starships could achieve an enormous range of different warp speeds, although the higher speeds were generally only safe in short bursts. The different warp speeds were classified according to the warp factor system, which set warp 1 as the equivalent to the speed of light, while higher factors were each an order of magnitude faster. During the early years of the Federation, warp factors were scaled according to a system laid out by Zefram Cochrane himself. The lower warp speeds on the scale were still slow enough that they effectively restricted a starship to local travel, and it wasn't until the development of Earth's first Warp 5 capable ship that humanity was truly able to make a place for itself in the universe. By the late 23rd century, some Federation starships were able to reach or even surpass Warp 10 on this scale, however doing so was generally considered unsafe. Starfleet vessels, at the time, had Warp 6 as the typical cruising speed, though they could sustain higher warp factors for several hours at any given time. By the early 24th century, however, the advancement of warp drive technology meant that the scale had to be revised. According to this new scale, Warp 10 became infinite velocity and thus theoretically unattainable, while Warp 1 remained equal to the speed of light, and all the warp factors between were adjusted to mean considerably faster speeds than they had under the original warp factor system. By the mid-24th century, Warp 6 was still the standard cruising speed for Starfleet vessels, but it was almost twice as fast as Warp 6 had been a century prior, and the higher warp factors far eclipsed the speeds of 21st century craft had ever been capable of. Now, there were likely further revisions to this scale in later centuries, as technology continued to develop. Even during the 24th century, there were still advances being made in warp theory, including the first ever transwarp flight, although that particular advancement had side effects that we'd all prefer to forget about. Nonetheless, we're sure that future Star Trek series will introduce new developments in warp theory, and we sincerely hope that none of them will involve weird space salamanders. Red alert! For Star Trek starships, action figures, and collectibles, check out our partner site, the Cargo Bay, now docked and ready. You'll find several of the starships featured in today's video available on the Cargo Bay's website. Hit the link in the description and explore. So, that's a look at the warp drive, one of the most important pieces of technology in the Star Trek universe. What should we look at next in terms of technology? Maybe quantum slipstream, transwarp drive, or something else? If you want to keep up to date on the latest Star Trek news, lore, and more, then make sure to hit that subscribe button to never miss a video from the team here at Trek Central. You can also follow us on social media or join our community Discord server. A big thank you to everyone who supports us on Patreon. Your support allows us to continue making these Galaxy class videos. For now, I've been Captain Jack, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Live long and prosper, my friends. Goodbye.